Good morning, my lord.
Good morning, Mr. Turner. Now, you have a witness for us this morning?
I do indeed. The first witness today, my lord, is Mr. Martin Dorchester from Includem.
Good morning, Mr. Dorchester.
Good morning, my lord.
Right, now Mr. Turner will have some questions for you. I have no doubt. Mr. Turner, when you're ready.
Thank you, my lord. Good morning, Mr. Dorchester.
Morning.
Before I begin, Mr. Dorchester, just to remind you that today's hearing will be transcribed. If you could try and speak slowly and clearly, that will help our stenographers greatly. Could you state your full name, please?
Yeah, my name is Martin Dorchester.
Thank you. And what is your current position?
I'm currently the Chief Executive of Includem.
Thank you. And how long have you held that position?
Just over 6 years now.
Thank you. You've provided a written statement on behalf of Includem, is that correct?
That's the inquiry.
Correct. The reference for that, my lord, is SCI WT 0616 number 1. We're going to talk this morning, Mr. Dorchester, about some of the matters that you've raised in that statement. We have an hour. Hopefully we'll get through quite a lot, okay. But please rest assured that everything that's contained in that statement, and indeed any other documentation that you provided to the inquiry, will be considered in full by His Lordship. Okay. I'd like to ask you some questions, first of all, about Includem itself. Could you tell us when was Includem established and why?
Yeah. So Includem was incorporated in 2000 as a charity and a private limited company, but not limited by shares. It was set up by the founders predominantly to respond to crisis amongst young people and families. Originally, the bulk of the work that they did was based in South Lanarks, but over the last 25 years next year, that has developed across Scotland, but still a significant focus on responding to crisis amongst children, young people and families.
Thank you. You mentioned there that they support children and families in crisis. Could you explain to His Lordship in a little more detail why they need support, or the kinds of children that need support?
Yeah. Not all, but the majority of the children and families we work with will be based in areas of high deprivation. They will be the most challenged families to reach, and I do use challenge rather than challenging, because we have to find ways to get to those families. They tend to need more wraparound and intensive support than a social worker individually could give them. Therefore, having an organisation that's not statutory and therefore doesn't have some of the I'm going to say baggage, it's not really baggage, but some of the challenges that statutory services bring to those families. So having an organisation like Includem that can be there is vastly important for them.
Thank you. You used the term challenged there.
Yeah.
What is causing the challenge, if I can ask it that way?
Statutory services becomes one of them. It's the interesting one is, I'm the man from the government, I've come to help you. That's not really what they want to hear. In terms of stigma, the moment that, all research will show you that the moment that children and young people come into contact with the police or come into contact with social services, life tends to get worse for them. So again, there's a fear of having statutory services and statutory bodies come into them. But there's also that flexibility that an organisation like ours can bring that means that we can perhaps... So we do 24/7 service, which is unusual because we truly do 24/7 service. So when they try and avoid us, we rock up at different times, and therefore we've that flexibility that we have, that we can operate with, that allows us then to get in. And that's what I mean in terms of challenged. And that's before you even get to the communities such as some of our ethnic communities who have a real challenge with dealing with statutory services in any way, shape or form. So that flexibility and that ability for us to respond is a real key driver.
Thank you. In your statement, you used the term adverse childhood experience, or ACE.
Yeah.
Does that relate to the children that you help?
Pretty much all the children that we work with will have 3 or 4 or 5 adverse childhood experiences. And again, if you go and look at research, you'll find that amongst many of the children and families we work with, that's a common theme.
And what kind of experiences would you be referring to when you refer to adverse childhood experiences?
So bereavement, which I might touch on later in terms of working with different sectors, so bereavement in the family, domestic violence, abuse, criminology, generational families. So I think there's a huge list of what they have, but they tend to be the key ones.
Thank you. And what sort of age groups do you work with, or does Includem work with?
So we're registered with the Care Inspectorate to work from 0 to 26. But the reality is, as I said, we work with children and families, so 0 to however long they live, as it were.
But the children in those families, though, you're saying 0 to 26, so it's quite a large range there. Thank you. You referred to, if I can put it this way, individualised support for the families and the children. Why is it that Includem is providing that as opposed to, say, for example, a statutory service?
Yeah. I think, and I may come on to it later, there's almost a mythology that statutory bodies are the only ones who do statutory services. A huge amount of statutory service delivery is by the third sector, and it gets missed, that, but it is a huge element of that. But also then on top of that, if you think in terms of caseload, we might meet with social services and they'll refer a young person to us that needs our support. We might meet one young person who requires maybe 3 hours a week support. We might meet the next young person who requires 10 hours a week. And it's that flexibility that we can do, that social work will not have that flexibility inbuilt. I'm just using social work, there's other areas like that, but it's that flexibility and that different support package that we can do.
You've used social work as an example. If you were to describe the kind of work that Includem does, how would you describe the kind of work that it does in that context?
Yeah, so we work with young people to try and get them on the track for a better future and a better outcome. And we do that in a variety of ways. We have toolkits such as A Better Life, where we talk about consequential impacts of what young people and their behaviours do. And so when social work refer them to us, there'll invariably be a challenge somewhere in there that we then can work, and we will work flexibly. And I think, again, the benefit is it might be a justice challenge, so therefore we've got expertise in working in the justice area. Or it might be an educational challenge, and we've got expertise working in that. It might be a housing challenge. And it's that bit around, again, we don't always look at children and families holistically, and so we talk about social services, but invariably it will cut across multiple services, and we can do that, and that, I think, is one of the key things that we bring to that service delivery.
Are you providing services that, in other circumstances, statutory services would be providing, though?
Yes.
For example, social work services?
Yeah, contextual safeguarding, homelessness, things like that. They're statutory services and will be delivered by the third sector and organisations like us.
Thank you. And you mentioned there referrals from social work. Is that the only route into your service?
No, we have multiple routes into service. It's our key role because we as a although we're a charity, we're also a business, and we bid for contracts and we deliver services. So therefore, when we do that with social work, it will be a social work referral. But we also work in schools. We also get we have an emergency response team, so we get private referrals, people who go and find us on the internet. We work alongside police, so we'll get other referrals through police. So it's mainly social work, but we don't turn people away unless we have to.
Thank you. In terms of how you deliver the services in terms of your staff approaching an individual or a family. Could you explain to His Lordship how that works?
Yeah. The perfect version of it, as it were, that we would say is we do a wraparound service, and we have normally per young person and family 3 people: a project worker, an assistant project worker, and a mentor support person. We normally have 3 people because that then, with the best will in the world, even as good as I think our team are, there'll be times when they just do not connect with the family. So therefore you've got to have that flexibility that says if, for example, the project worker and the family don't connect, then the assistant project worker and the family might connect. So we build some capacity into that to get that relationship, because fundamentally it's about relationships and relationship building. So we will do that. Once we've done, and I'll use social work because they're probably the more disciplined in terms of how you do that. Social work will create a referral. We'll have a referral meeting with social work, and they'll talk about what they see as the issues with that family. We will then go and talk to the family, the young people, and come back with our understanding of it as well, so that we can then marry the 2 up. We will then agree a package of support, and it might be that we will say we'll work with this family for the next 3 months. And I'll keep saying family, even though we talk about we work with young people, but we will work with the young person and his family for the next 3 months, and we will do 4 hours support per week. These are the things that we will get involved with. This is the things that we'll work on. But we will also, during that period, keep updating social work if things change and if there's something that we need to do. So if crisis happens, or if things improve quicker than we expect, we can then be flexible about how we do that. If all things go to plan, as it were, and we get, say, that young person back on the right track, we will then do what we now call a moving on from, we used to call it an exit interview, but we need to now moving on, and those young people will move on. Because ultimately you want to get them into what's the best place for them. And as much as I would say we're non-stigmatising, of course in one sense we are, because they're having to work with an organisation like ourselves. So, you know, we'd want to maybe get them back into school so they're back on track in school, or if they're in work, get them back into track on work, and then we can start to pull back. But that's sort of the general delivery of service.
Thank you. And in terms of how long you might support somebody or a child or family, how long do you support them for? Or how long are you available to support them for?
So, as I would say, we're a 24/7 operation. We have some families that we have been supporting for over a year, depending on the severity or the challenge that they face. Normally, I can use that word, but normally we would look at 12 weeks to 6 months. If we're not cutting through at that stage, then we maybe need to look at a different approach to that, and it might not be us.
And if a child has left your service,
yeah,
and needed further support, would Includem be available for that?
Yeah, we have a 24/7 support line. Much as I might tell my people sometimes not to respond to calls, they respond to calls. We have, I think I've not touched on it in my report, but we have the youth advisory group. The youth advisory group that we have consists of people who've previously used our services, so where possible we keep those linkages. What we try to avoid for the young people and families we work with, we leave it to them rather than us following them, if that makes sense, because there's a stigma still that's always been attached with you've been referred to us. So if they want to contact us, they can. We wouldn't necessarily follow the other way until they contacted us.
Thank you. You mentioned when you were talking about the ideal scenario and the 3 people approach, and the fact that, my word not yours, people might not click. Yeah. Are relationships important in what you do?
Yeah, it's all about relationships for us. We have to build trust as fast as we possibly can with the children and the families that we're working with. And part of the reason for that trust building is that that's probably one of the big things that they miss in life, full stop. But it also then enables us to have frank and open, challenging discussions with them. Because the situations that they will be in their life they need people of trust, that they can talk to and be open. Otherwise, how do you ever get out of that spiral? So for us, everything we will talk about is wedded in relationship and building relationships and developing relationships, and how do we do that? So,
thank you. I'll come back to those relationships very shortly. I just want to ask you two further very brief questions about the organisation.
yeah.
Just in terms of the size of the organisation, just so His Lordship has a bit of a feel for that, could you tell me how many people work for Includem?
Yeah, so we're up to about, I think it's 194 at the last count. We work in 19 local authorities, but across Scotland with our emergency response service.
And that emergency response service, to whom does that provide services?
Yeah, so people, I think going back to the original question, people who have not referred to us is one element of it that will find us on Google and search. Local authorities use us, so we will have contracts to deliver what we would call our core service. But if something happens in a local authority that's not covered by that service, then they will directly engage us to deliver emergency services for them. And then schools, sometimes through PEF funding and things like that, will use us. But essentially, local authorities are the big user on that area.
And you said you have contracts with 19 for
yeah.
your core service. In terms of the emergency service, is that to a wider array of local authorities?
Yeah, I mean, it includes the 19, so because it's out with that contract, yeah, but it's available to all 32.
To all 32, thank you. And just in terms of funding, how is Includem ordinarily funded?
Yeah, so I think I touched on earlier, we bid for contracts, so I think when we submitted, I think in terms of COVID, we were probably 75% local authority. We're probably closer to 60% local authority now, 20% government. We probably 10% now in health, and then we look at other funding when and how we can get it.
And what level of turnover are you talking about in
so
terms
we're
of spend?
turning over £6 million a year.
£6 million a year. Thank you. I'd like to talk to you now about changes in the service during the pandemic, if I may. You've mentioned, of course, the importance of relationships, about the wraparound support that's offered. Could you explain to His Lordship what changes occurred in respect of that service provision during the pandemic?
Yeah. So I think, as I said, my Lord, that relationship building is key to how we deliver our services. Part of that relationship building is us laying eyes on the people that we're delivering those services to, seeing the environment that they're living in and the area that they're in, seeing who's available there, being able to see state condition, so that we don't just rely on what we're being told. We can then make our own assessment of what's happening. The challenge for us when lockdown came was that immediately we had to cease seeing people. Multitude of reasons, not least being we were no longer insured. And I think some of the areas that we go in, that's quite challenging for my team. We didn't have PPE, and at that stage it was very unclear on what was happening with PPE. So we went from being predominantly a face-based meeting in person organisation to having to divert onto different forms of technical media. Don't get me wrong, we're quite a tech-savvy organisation and we were using digital media as you'd expect us to, but what we weren't doing at that time was giving out individual workers and telephone numbers and WhatsApps to the families that we work with and young people we work with, so we have a 24/7 helpline. And what it did to us was just put an absolute block on that.
In terms of the number of children and families that you could assist at that time, how was that affected?
Yeah, so we work with about 500 families per I'd say per quarter, but probably per 6 months, about 500 families per 6 months. Suddenly you can't go out to see them, and you would see 4 or 5 in a day. We were suddenly looking at best probably 1 or 2 in a day. and therefore we then had to prioritise who were the most, I think you said needy then, but who needed us the most. Yeah, and that would not necessarily be how they felt, because depending on the situation that they were in, that would be part of the driver. So overnight, we probably more than halved who we could see.
And how did you've touched upon it there? But how did you determine which children you were seeing and which, frankly, you weren't seeing?
Yeah. A mixture. So a mixture in terms of discussion with social work, who they would see as the families that were most in need of support. The fact that my team know the people. The way, and I don't know if things have been covered in terms of understanding of social work and how we operate, but my team managers do supervision on a regular basis with our frontline workers. So all that, what that means, on an ongoing basis, they're talking about families, they're assessing families, and they're assessing need, and they're assessing risk. And so part of it would be from social work, and then part of it would be from that discussion there. And also because of the way we were set up with the helpline, it would also part be driven by people contacting us with that need. So a mixture of areas that we would use.
Did that have any, again, my word, not yours, but triaging in terms of choosing some and not others, did that have any impacts on the young people that you would ordinarily deal with?
Yeah. I think for us, but for young people as a whole, they felt abandoned at that time. And I think that it's very hard to explain to someone who's quite fearful of what's happening anyway, that maybe their case is not as serious as someone else's case. So suddenly you're comparing and contrasting, which is not something you would want to do. The coverage in the media generated so much anxiety, and their lives, as an element of their life, one element of it, but the rest of their life was changing as well. And so therefore, because we couldn't necessarily see what was happening in the home environment, which is something we would normally be able to see as well, I think there were young people that their lives were worse than we realised, and got worse very quickly. And we were not able to get out to all of them because we weren't allowed.
You've mentioned a couple of times the importance of relationships between your staff and the individuals that they're dealing with.
Yeah.
Did that restriction have any effect on your staff members?
Yeah, so I think we're still dealing with that. I think we're still dealing with some of the guilt that people feel, that we had to make decisions that we wouldn't want to have made, but we did. I think there are still families who have not recovered from that, and my team are out there, will see that. We put lots of support in place, but the reason that they come and work for us is they want to make a difference, and a positive difference. And at that time, it felt like we were making the least worst decisions rather than making the best decisions.
You touched upon something before. I'd like to talk to you briefly about some policy changes that you made in terms of how your staff were operating. You mentioned the prioritisation in terms of having to see some children, not others. You mentioned, I think, also the way telephone calls were being handled.
Yeah.
Could you tell us about that?
Yeah. So we, as an organisation, we didn't give out a telephone, or we didn't give out our team's telephone numbers to children and young people. We have a helpline for that. One of the main drivers for that is that some of the work we do is really intense, and people need to be able to get away and switch off, and that's really difficult if you're using your phone and you're getting calls at all times of the day and night. But because we weren't getting out and we needed to talk to them, we gave out our telephone numbers, or staff gave out their telephone numbers and their WhatsApp, so that again it's another route for us to be able to see and talk to people. That was a huge change for them. But because if you compound that by the fact that children and young people were feeling insecure, frightened, scared, their use, as it were, of the phone suddenly rocketed. So, you know, if you have a look at our helpline, you'll see the calls drop at our helpline. So if you looked at that in isolation, you think that, you know, it was quiet, but actually then you see the rocketing. And when I say that, the scale of the calls just rocketed, so that people were then getting directly to their own phone, and conversations are getting direct to their own phone. Some challenges there. I touched back on supervision, that, you know, we have a mixture of experienced staff and not experienced staff, because it's like any other organisation. Usually, you know, when we're assessing cases and we're assessing relationships, you've got a bit of time, and you can escalate it up and down to your team manager or to a service manager who's very experienced, and work out how you're going to respond to that. And a lot for our team, we suddenly have to, maybe an inexperienced person responding to a call of a really severe issue. If you've been in a call and someone's on a call to you, trying to say, can you just like go on hold while I phone someone up and talk this through and come back to you with advice? Just so it meant that we were starting to find some of our team were having to deal with things that would normally have escalated up, and we could have managed that escalation. So I think that was one issue. I think second issue, children and young people are wonderful at like trickery, as it were. I say that tongue in cheek. So switching screens off, and you know, technology is not working, and therefore you can't see them and you can't see where they were. So you know, we're trying on the phone to start just unpick. So who's there with you? Are you on your own? Is there someone? You know, what are you doing? It's a slightly different skill from actually going. And it sounds strange that, but actually, you know, if you think about it, when you create a composite picture, it will not be just what people say; it's how they behave, how they look, what they're wearing. And so again, we've got challenges for the team of trying to just unpick. And then if you think as well, the situations of the young people we're working with, that you know, you're not phoning to see, you know, is it a nice day today? There's an issue. So that was huge for us. Probably the second biggest thing, and what people didn't miss, cars and car travel are really important to us, and the change in that was massive for us. And what do I mean by that? I would advise you, one of the things that you do in a car and you don't realise is that you get bored, so you start telling things that you wouldn't normally talk about. And that's amazing for us with the young people we work with. You get them in a car and they get bored and they'll tell you lots of stuff. Fantastic, yeah. You might get two of them in a car, so because we work with siblings, so you might get three of them in cars, you work with family. We couldn't do any of that, and when we first started, we couldn't do that. And then even when we said we could use cars, we could see people, you could only take one person in the car and they would sit behind you. So again, some of the skills and the ways that we would get and elicit information and understanding suddenly would disappeared. So we're having to find a whole different way back round those routes to get to the understanding we need of what's happening in that young person's life. So it's a massive difference for people. And then probably the third thing that I would say, you know, they're frontline. My team are frontline people. That's what they do. And suddenly we stop them doing what they do. You know, they go out into communities, they see things that are happening, they connect into communities, they build networks. You know, we're the best in the world. When you've got them sitting at home, they can't do that.
Thank you. You mentioned there some of the impacts of what we refer to as social distancing. Excuse me, I understand from what you're saying that your staff members didn't get to go into homes for quite a considerable period of time. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Could you explain to His Lordship why that's important in order to do your work?
Yeah. Being honest, they probably went into homes more times than I knew, because they would. But a lot of the families that we work with, knowing who in the family is there is really important, and often you don't get told, so you need to be there to see who's there. Is just one thing. Second thing, in terms of that, if I almost do it from when you turn up at curbside, my team will look and see who's about in the area, if there is anyone. So that. Second, when they get into the premises, they will see how the people in the house present. Third thing that they can then do is sometimes separate people to have slightly different discussions, and that it helps us to correlate. Has what mum's told me matching what son's telling me, so that there's a correlation element in there. There's also a bit that allows us to work out, do we need to get that young person out of that house for a period of time? That's not necessarily because of a bad thing, but in terms of sometimes that proximity, that intensity of relationships that you might need to just give a bit of breathing space to. I think, I haven't seen who you have spoken to, but it wasn't, the growth or the increase in domestic abuse through COVID was quite significant. The increase in abuse to young people was quite significant. And again, being able to see it is important. And probably a good example of that, one of my team turned up, and what we were doing initially for some of the families that we work with was we'd go and do the shopping for them, and we'd drop it on the doorstep, ring the bell, and go to the bottom of the garden, as it were, go to the gate, so that we just see that they can. Actually, one of my team had been to see a family and dropped the shopping, went to the bottom of the garden, waited to see that, and Gran came out, and she realised Gran had a black eye. So basically went back in to find out what was going on. And it's that ability to be able to see and do. And I say that carefully because at that stage we weren't allowed to go into premises, and we did, because it was the right thing to do, and that's what they do.
Thank you. Before I leave this section, just a couple more questions, if I may. In terms of the mobile phones, you've talked about the fact that we're getting direct contacts from clients. You've talked about the fact that your service is 24/7. Were the calls coming through 24/7 to your staff?
Yeah.
And what impact did that have on them?
Much as I would mandate, don't answer your phone, people would answer phones. So I worked on the premise that they would do that, and we put supports in place within the organisation. But I think over a period of time, that's a slow burn, and people are tired, and people got tired, and it got harder. And part of the challenge is once you've put something into play, unpicking it is now an impossible. So we're still contending with that as an issue today around the use of phones, and how we use them and how young people and families use them. So it's still, it was right, but it's hard.
Does that mean your service hasn't reverted to pre-pandemic means of operation?
Yes and no. So we're out. We were very quickly out seeing people. As soon as we forced key worker status through, we were out seeing families, etc. But now we have a mixture of, we still have a helpline. We still have, once you've given the number out, you've given the number out. So.
His Lordship has heard evidence over the last 2 weeks, in fact longer than that, last 6 weeks, in terms of closures of various services, schools in particular, and also other statutory and other services. Did that impact on any of your work?
Yeah, hugely. So I think a couple of areas that were big impact for us: schools closing, and I think somewhere in the statement you'll see, I think if we'd have gone back and listened to the voices of young people, we wouldn't have had the second lockdown for young people. But schools closing, schools are a huge source of information and support for us, and vice versa. So a lot of the times when a young person presents poor behaviour at school, it's because of something happening at home or in the community. So that sharing of knowledge and working alongside is really important. So schools closing was huge. I don't think we've fully understood the impact on young people of the transitions that they missed because of schools closing, and we're seeing some of that behaviour now. And I think you'll see my statement, some of the behaviour we're seeing now, maybe, I can't say for definite, but maybe would have worked its way through in maturation in a transition, but it's now happening at a younger age because they didn't have that transition to go through. Social skills, challenging. So school closing, massive issue. Closing a second time, even worse, we would say, for a multitude of reasons. Cafes, restaurants, shops closing for us, again, massive issue. When we want to get young people out of a house or get them into a more relaxed environment to talk, it's not unusual we take them to McDonald's, and I'm not floating McDonald's, but a restaurant somewhere for a cup of coffee, cup of tea, just to get them away and break it down. I touched on it earlier. If we'd have sat down with the private sector, we would have talked to them about really being careful about these things close, because it's that decision that's made that you don't fully realise the knock-on implications. So, us not being able to get young people, for the number of Scottish people in here, you think about the weather in Scotland, when the only alternative for us is to get them out of the house is take them for a walk in the weather we get. It's not great. So getting them out of the house to get for a coffee or get for a McDonald's or a KFC is a part of our armoury. So those closing, was dreadful. Any space that you could get out and get into that then closed, and I don't know if people remember it, but at one stage the police were moving people sitting on a bench in a park and saying you can't sit and talk for that long. I think 10-15 minutes. We're trying to get an hour and talk. So those spaces being closed was just devastating for us. Retail, you start moving online. I think within my statement, one of the things that, and it didn't really surprise us, but did surprise us, was when we were putting money into families, most people did think it would be about digital and it would be about, technology. Actually, we would find it was clothes, it was bedding, it was basic living things. You can do so much online, but actually being able to get into a retail store and take a family into a retail store and buy them a bed that's the right size and is really important. So things like that closing were massively important, and that's where I get into about getting the public, the private and the third sector together just to have a proper discussion that says it might seem really sensible, and I get why you're doing it, but the knock-on was huge for us, and we're still feeling it.
Thank you. You've touched upon a few things already, but I'd like to ask you a few more questions about the impacts on the children and the families themselves. In terms of the removal of the wraparound support and the relationship building opportunities, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, did that have any particular impacts for families or children within families?
Yeah. So there would have been families where, because that service wasn't available, may have meant that a young person was kept in a residential unit, or vice versa, a young person might have been released, as it were, from a residential unit into the family and no support there, and then ended up going back. That's probably the worst case scenario of that. But then I touch on transitions is massively important. One of the things that we become, because of the way we work, is we become a trusted person to that family or that young person, and then suddenly we're not there, and suddenly the only way they can get hold of us is on a phone call, and depending if they, we've got them as high priority, they may not be able to get hold of us. So the impact just keeps manifesting and growing. And as I said, I'm not, all the other things that are going on in community as well just add to that. I think the other thing that it took away from us is, in some ways, that very early engagement is really important, because you start to set the boundaries, etc. So there would have been children and families we didn't see for 4, 8, 12 weeks. And I think I probably touched on it, and I think I used CAMS as one of the examples. It wasn't unusual for young people to have a 17-week referral to CAMS. I could probably argue if we'd have been there with them in the first 2 or 3 weeks, they might not have needed that referral to CAMS. So by the time they hit CAMS, it is off the scale intense. If actually we'd been there day 1, or week 1, week 2, that escalation would not necessarily have taken place. It's hard to quantify those, but what we're seeing now is that impact working its way through. So it's a huge impact that people weren't there, we weren't there, and there'd be other organisations like us that weren't there.
His Lordship is probably familiar with CAMS, but in case anyone else who's watching this isn't, if you could just explain who CAMS are.
Yeah, so they work with children's mental health. Yeah, so and I think you've got Sam H as the adult mental health, and CAMS as children's mental health. And this is where they would normally be referred, normally by a doctor, for mental health support.
And you alluded to it a moment ago, but would your service hopefully preempt some of the need for that referral? Yeah, so in I touch on again now when we talk about public services, and that people don't always realise how much third sector do that. But I have mental health first aiders and mental health trained professionals in my organisation who will provide tier 1 mental health support. So, and hopefully what you do is you get them in tier 1, and they don't escalate to tier 2, tier 3, and tier 2, tier 3 is when you start to move into CAMS and into medical interventions, which is something that we try and avoid. Thank you. You've touched upon quite a lot of the impacts as we've been talking during the pandemic. As we move forward into post-pandemic, are you seeing any different behaviours or effects continuing in terms of what you're seeing in children now as a result of what happened in the pandemic?
I think, so a couple of things that we're seeing. Although we do 0 to 26, if I'd have looked at the organisation 6 or 7 years ago, I'd probably said that the bulk of children and young people we work with probably about 15 and upwards. And we're seeing that from 10 and upwards now. Can I directly causal that to COVID? No. Do I think it correlates? Yeah. Do I think we'll get to a stage where when we look back we'll say that's absolutely, I think we will. So we're seeing that intensity of behaviour that I think through normal transition and maturation processes would have come to the fore. So we're seeing that now. Maybe at the end I'll come on to I don't think we listened enough to the voices of children and young people through COVID, and we didn't hear what they were saying well enough. We listened to other groups but not children and young people. And we put them in a situation where school and home suddenly intertwined, and that's really hard for them then to understand when we say you have to go to school. They say, well, when it suits, we don't. And I'm being really simplistic about that, but essentially that's what we did with them. And so we're starting to see that in terms of some of the behaviours that are coming through. At an older group, you know, we've got young people at university or in apprenticeships who never had to deal with exams and putting under that sort of pressure and are struggling with it. So I think that's become hugely challenging. I think we did a couple of surveys through and research through that period of time and after that period of time. As I said, I think the impact of the second lockdown was colossal, and we're starting to see that play through now. I think probably the families that we see, we started off, and we're not touched on it, but we started off and COVID didn't create poverty in the families that we work with. That was already there. It amplified that poverty. And when we started off, you know, we were giving them vouchers, etc. And I think if you remember early on when you said about one of the issues with them is stigma, we stigmatised them right at the outset. They were already stigmatised, or they already felt that way, but we stigmatised them even further. We gave them vouchers, and then we stigmatised their children because they got vouchers, and it took us time to unpick from that, but it's still there. So I think I think we're probably now in a place where we're suffering more from it and not fully realising how much damage it did.
I'd like to talk to you now about potential lessons in the way that we might deliver support. You've mentioned one there in terms of stigmatisation. Is there a better way of, or is there a way of avoiding that stigmatisation?
Yeah, I think government came through with what they call cash first, and started to trust and sorry, I'll be careful when I say this. So when I say about government, I sort of mean big government and small government as well. So central government, local authorities, yeah. So the move to cash first was the right thing to do. Trust families with cash. Don't give them vouchers. Don't ask them to account for what they've done. So that was a really good step forward. I think we've gone backwards on that, and we've lost sight of some of that, and we've got back into, rather than trust families, we now want them to account for everything that they've spent. So it was a good step. We've gone back. I think other lessons that we should have picked up earlier, I'd go back to that one around talking and listening to children and families about their experience and involving them in the decision making. We do a lot of talk about listening to lived experience. There's a lot of lived experience there that I'm not sure we're hearing, so I don't know if the inquiry is going to talk to young people, but I would recommend it does. Because I think they will give you lessons that more brutally than perhaps I would about what they went through. So I think that lesson learned from us there. I suppose we've not really touched on it, but again, I'll come back on it. The areas we tend to work in tend to be the areas of highest deprivation. We did some work and we looked at it. I think it was 35% of the families that we work with were in work, suffering from poverty in work. COVID came along, and then we put them on 80% of their salary. So we're already in a place where this is the most challenged people. We have in-work poverty. We then put them on furlough. They're on 80% of what they were on, and they weren't on a lot to start with. We're also then going to add to them the fact that they're going to have extra heating bills, they're going to have extra food bills because the family's at home, etc. And we wondered why they got into even worse situation. So there's something there for me in terms of that. Again, how we bring third sector, public sector and private sector together that says, what were the unintended consequences of some of the things that we did for whatever, I'm not decrying the reasoning and the fact, in terms of furlough, I think the thinking behind it I understood completely. It's that application and the unintended or the unthought through consequences of that application. They were the things for me in terms of what lessons we could learn and should learn and need to learn.
You've mentioned the trust put in third sector organisations such as Includem in respect of delivery of funding and the like. Was Includem involved in delivery of funds to children and young people? Yeah. So one of the benefits that we have, so as an organisation set up as a charity, but also as we're a business. Yeah. So my frontline team all have credit cards and all have access to cash. Yeah, because we do that. Yeah, it is not unusual for us to support and help a family out, and because of the way we work, what I don't want is, one of my team phoned me up saying, someone needs a bed, Martin, can I go and buy them? Of course they can. Go and do it. So we were already set up to do that. Basically, all we needed was cash to come in, and we could just do that. Whereas local authorities, central government, you'd go through a whole heap of conditions to get that. So we got funding from Scottish Government, from local authorities and from Barclays on cash first, so that we could just go and do direct cash awards and direct support. From the supported individuals' perspective, is that an easier way to get cash? Are there any particular difficulties which they might suffer in terms of ability to otherwise access those kinds of funds? Yeah. So again, the moment, so I've touched on vouchers, which would stigmatise, and anyone who gets, I don't know, £100 factory outlet voucher, and they're sat there trying to work out, have I spent £100, have I spent £95 or whatever, and then can't get change. You wouldn't believe the stress that they go through that. So vouchers is really difficult for them. So when we talk them through around how do we help them out, we also have to watch out if they're on benefits and we start putting cash into their bank, their benefit potentially then could get impacted, and we need to be very conscious of that. I think secondly, in terms of what they're buying,
think we probably need a few hours if I really went into this, but some of the families we work with were nervous about buying and being visibly seen to buy or have cash at different times because of the environment that they're in, or the people that they're operating with, or the people that are in their lives, etc. So, you know, you give them £100 and say, buy some technology, and you go back and find that technology is not there. Well, part of the reason may be that they have sold it for a different reason, but also it might be that they're worried because they can't pay the ongoing bill. So in terms of cash, it's absolute. Yeah, so that's £100. Yeah. In terms of what doing that stopped them as well in taking out loans and borrowing from other people. And again, I don't think people fully realise in terms of, especially in some of the environments that we operate in, the impact of other cash sources. So creating a cash source that wasn't going to impinge on them is really important.
You've mentioned there the purchase of devices. One of the issues which His Lordship has heard very often from third sector is questions of digital exclusion. Yeah. Was that an issue that you came across as well? Yeah, huge issue. I can remember speaking at an event where I think the title of the event was digital inclusion, and I said, well, the problem I have is like the bulk of people we work with are excluded, and we can talk all week about inclusion, but there are multiple layers to the digital exclusion. You know, there is that bit around ongoing cost of it that for families that we work with couldn't afford necessarily the ongoing cost. But there's also some of them choose to be excluded because we created an environment where they weren't getting out and you couldn't see them, but actually you put them online. There's a whole raft of challenges then and different issues to deal with once they're online, especially for young people. And again, we're dealing with a lot of that now in terms of what's happening online. So sometimes when you talk about exclusion, people think, as it were, physically or technically, but there's that understanding of it. So a lot of the families that we work with, you could buy them technology, you could support them technology, but mum or dad don't know how to use it, so that becomes an issue. Multiple siblings in the family want to use it, that becomes an issue. Real depth of knowledge and understanding of when you switch that on, what's going to happen is missing. So, you know, it's not just, as it were, because they don't have a laptop or they don't have a mobile phone. They don't necessarily know how to use that. They don't necessarily know the safeguards in it. We don't put things in place to help them understand that. And if you think about it at that time as well, probably one of the places that would learn to use it was school, and school was closed. So we compounded an issue. I'm conscious of the time, Mr. Dorchester, and there's just a couple more things I'm hopeful to get through, so I'm going to take them relatively quickly, if I may. Okay. I'd like to talk to you very briefly about your staff, essentially, and the operations of Includem. Did your staff have key worker status? Yes and no. I think I put in my statement, the letter that came out wasn't clear on what a key worker was, or wasn't clear on what a key worker wasn't. And that was evidenced by the fact that some authorities saw us as key workers and some authorities didn't see us as key workers. So we did get key worker status, but on a number of authorities we still had to keep going through the same loop. You mentioned in your statement that I think there was a letter issued by a minister which you'd indicated was unclear. Yes. And then further letters by some local authorities, is that correct? Yeah. But ultimately Includem issued its own letter to staff, is that correct? It was me. Yes, I did. Is there a lesson to be learned in that regard, do you think? Yeah. I'll keep coming back now. I hope I don't sound like a broken record. I think it is that recognition of the third sector being part of the public services delivery. And if that was absolutely crystal clear, we would never have got, you know, I don't think anyone asked a policeman, are you a key worker? Because we just take them as
granted that they're part of that. So yeah, there's a lesson for me around that's what the third sector does.
We've talked about the fact that the services you're providing are effectively and very often social work services that would otherwise be provided by local authorities and others. You also mentioned very briefly the availability of PPE.
Yes.
In terms of your access to PPE, did you have the same status as statutory workers?
Not to start with. So I think it's the first month we had to procure our own. Then when we got granted key worker status, our key local authority, our biggest local authority was Glasgow. Once they granted us key worker status, we could access PPE from Glasgow. But what I would say is, again, and this is the inconsistency of it, maybe a lesson to learn, that PPE was not inclusive of wipes. And I think if you remember back at the beginning of COVID, people were convinced it was you had to clean surfaces down. So just a small point, but that wasn't included in the PPE.
You've mentioned to His Lordship how Includem is funded through its contracts and the like. You've mentioned furlough.
Yeah.
Were any of your staff furloughed?
No, we didn't furlough anyone.
If they were sick, how were they paid?
So we changed our sick pay policy because we were creating a two-tier workforce. So if you were, I'll keep careful I say this, if you were a support services, what would traditionally be based in our operational offices, if you had COVID but weren't having symptoms for it, you could still work, so you could work from home. If you were a frontline worker and you had COVID, irrespective if you had symptoms or not, you couldn't go out and work. So we changed our sick pay policy to cover that, so that if any of our frontline workers were off sick, we extended the sick pay so that they got full pay throughout that sickness period.
Thank you. What was the financial impact on Includem of the pandemic as an organisation?
Crikey, yeah. I think in year one, we made a deficit of about £500,000 because, like a lot of organisations, we dig into our reserves and we put our money where our mouth is. We've not really touched on it. One of the reasons that I think the third sector and all really suffered through COVID, it's underfunded for many years before that, reliant on us providing our reserves, securing other types of funding, so you don't get a true cost of what the service is delivered. Suddenly when you come into periods such as a pandemic and actually you start looking at what's the real cost, it's significant. When you start seeing that you can't necessarily do your fund days out to raise funding over and above what you would get paid for your contracts. So we have made 3 years losses subsequent to that because we keep reinvesting, and without being political, we're still reinvesting because this funding for the third sector is not sufficient, and it needs. You shouldn't need a pandemic to tell people that.
Thank you. We just have literally a minute left, Ms. Dorchester. I'm going to give you an opportunity. I appreciate it's a very whistle-stop tour we've had. If there is anything particularly key that we haven't touched upon and you would like to highlight to His Lordship, I'll give you an opportunity to do that now. Yeah,
I think a couple of things that I would say. I have touched on it, but we didn't listen and talk to children and young people, and we need to hear their voices and what they went through. I think that's whatever lessons we want to take from COVID, please talk to them. I think the second thing, if we can take a lesson learned that says the third sector delivers public services, what more do you need to be part of the public sector than deliver public services? Because it's beyond me that, and I think that challenge we had over key worker status and the fact we had to fight that corner is ridiculous and it wasted time. I think probably the last thing that I would say on operational, not macro level, huge decision making, on operational level, we didn't get the public sector, the private sector and the third sector together on a regular basis to talk about what are the impacts of some of the things that we're doing and can we work together to change this. And if we could take something about how we bring, they for me the three pillars of any community. So how we cannot combine them at a time of pandemic, again, is beyond me, and we still suffer from the fact we don't fetch it together. and it would, I think, resolve a multitude of issues.
Thank you. My Lord, unless you have anything to add, that's all the questions I propose to put to this witness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Turner. Mr. Dorchester, I will say one thing, and I hope it's reassuring to you, that primarily through our listening project, Let's Be Heard, we have listened to and directly taken evidence from a significant cohort of young people, of children, and that, of course, will form part of our decision-making process. So I hope that's of some comfort to you. But thank you for your evidence and your
Thank you, my Lord.
time today. I'm very grateful. Yes, very good. About 11:15 then, for the next witness.
Thank you, my Lord.
The witness says.
My Lord.
Good morning again, Mr. Turner. Now, you've got a panel for us now.
We do indeed, my Lord. We have 4 representatives of organisations who are members of BEMIS. First of all, online, my Lord, we have Mrs. Magda Czarnecka, and then we're joined in the room by Mrs. Margaret Lance, Mrs. Bertha Yakubu, and Mr. Ephraim Borowski.
Very good. Well, good morning to you all. You're going to be asked some questions by Mr. Turner, so I'll hand over to him now. When you're ready, Mr. Turner.
Thank you, my Lord. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning. Is there any chance I could see the room? Thank you.
I'm being told not. Can I just remind everybody, this morning's hearing will be transcribed. If you could try and speak as slowly and clearly as possible, that would help our stenographers greatly. And if we could all try not to speak over each other, unlike Teams, the stenographers do struggle if we're all talking at the same time. I'm going to ask you all in turn if you could please state your full name, the organisation that you are involved with, and what your role is in that organisation. And if it was different during the pandemic, perhaps you could also give that indication. If I could start with Mrs. Czarnecka.
Hello, I'm Magda Czarnecka. I'm a CEO of Phoenix, and that was my role at the time.
Thank you. Mrs. Lance?
Good morning. My name is Margaret Lance. During the pandemic, I worked for Waverley Care, but as a community leader, I was also chair for Women in Action, as well as a board member for BEMIS.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Mrs. Yakubu?
My name is Bertha Yakubu. From Aberdeen. I run the African Women's Group. I was the founder, but I'm now a secretary in the group.
Thank you. And Mr. Borowski?
Good morning. I'm Ephraim Borowski. I'm the director of the Scottish Council of Jewish Communities, board member of BEMIS. I was, at the time, I think, the treasurer, but I've certainly been the treasurer and a past chair of BEMIS. And it may be relevant to an inquiry into COVID that I was asked by the previous Chief Constable to join the independent advisory group that the Scottish Police Authority set up to, I suppose, oversee is the wrong word, but to comment on the emergency legislation as it came along, which was about twice a day.
Thank you. Mr. Borowski, could I perhaps impose upon you to explain to His Lordship what BEMIS is?
Yes, BEMIS is the Scottish minority ethnic infrastructure organisation. A lot of the work that we do is, as it says, infrastructure. So it provides support to, for example, start-up community organisations, helping them draft a constitution, helping them register with Oscar, and so forth. But it also brings together organisations, and I think that's one of the things you probably want to explore, is that BEMIS took the initiative to set up what was called the Ethnic Minority Resilience Network, which brought together a lot of minority representatives of minority communities, including ones that very often are not on the radar. And that's maybe something else we can explore a little bit. Hope that helps.
Thank you. And could I just expand on that a little? Who are the members of BEMIS? What kinds of organisations?
Ethnic minority organisations, we were very careful when we drafted the Constitution probably now 10, 15 years ago, because some minority communities define themselves in terms of ethnicity and others define themselves in terms of culture or, for that matter, religion. The Jewish community is, of course, caught by both, as we saw in the Scottish census, but not in the English census, where Jewish was mentioned as there was a prompt to write in Jewish under other in the ethnicity question. So in order to capture all of these, we are very clear that we're not looking at race in the binary sense, which some people try to represent it, which of course completely misrepresents the facts. But we're capturing ethnic and cultural minorities. So organizations of a representative kind, so not, for example, communal welfare organizations or religious educational organizations, but organizations that have it as their purpose to represent members of a particular community, can then affiliate to BEMIS, which very clearly doesn't speak for them, but gives them an opportunity and encourages them to speak for themselves.
Thank you. And you've mentioned there that BEMIS doesn't speak for organisations, it's bringing these organisations together. Is that how I should understand it?
Absolutely. It facilitates the communities speaking for themselves.
Thank you. And perhaps I could follow up on that and ask you all to speak for yourselves, and perhaps Mrs. Czarnecka, I could ask you to explain what your organisation, Phoenix, is, and what they do in your community.
Phoenix has been set up 17 years ago to work and support Central Eastern European communities, mostly in Edinburgh, also Scotland. We were set up as a mental health organization, but grew to support the integration, raise awareness on health inequalities, provide advocacy, and since COVID actually to advocate for human rights of the migrant communities in Scotland.
Thank you. And Mrs. Lance, could you tell us about Women in Action and indeed any other organisations that you've been involved with?
Well, I said earlier on, I work for Waverley Care as Community Engagement Coordinator, which I no longer work with them. And Waverley Care is an organization that supports people living with HIV or affected by HIV and other bloodborne viruses. I was a community engagement coordinator at the time, but we do support people with other issues. We're using referral pathways because we couldn't do everything. So for Women in Action, it's just a group of women that have come together looking at how we can help them change their mindsets, shift their mindsets, and look into issues that matter to them. It could be domestic violence, it could be parenting, whatever issues they had. But based on the fact that we didn't have funding, we had partners that we could identify the issues, listen to the women, and then signpost them or accompany them to wherever the referral was made. And education as well. Many of them come with qualifications, but they're still quite confused what they want to do, getting jobs. So it's about bringing them together, sharing and learning new knowledge. Thank you.
And Mrs. Yakubu, African Women's Group Scotland, could you tell us about that?
African Women's Scotland was formed in 1994. We are over 30 years now. And it was formed primarily because we were very few, and so there was a lot of isolation, especially for women, because majority of them came along with their husbands that were studying. So the women are the ones left with small children in the house. As my colleagues here said, they can't get jobs, and they don't know anybody. And the further north you go, the less people like me you will see. So we were really very few. I really have to walk down the street, Union Street in Aberdeen, looking for African women. And not only are we isolated, we are not seen, we are not heard, we don't feature in anything. And yet these women have a lot of experience and a lot to give, and yet they don't have the opportunity. So I formed a group so that we can have a voice, we can do things for ourselves, find out our own problems and solve it. But COVID came and turned everything upside down, because majority of the people that I work with, they don't have recourse to public funds. And they work, if they were students, they work to pay their school fees or pay rent. And if, and it's sometimes only the woman that works, the man is studying. And during COVID, everything was shut down. And so I have never seen an African person beg for food, ask for food. But during COVID, I was getting calls. And we are just a charity without funding. So we just, when they say everything shut down, we shut down and just, we don't have an office, we don't have staff, we do everything on voluntary basis. And suddenly, women were phoning, and they were crying, and children were crying. You can hear the children crying because there's no food in the house. And so that is how we got involved with the COVID thing. It's not something that we prepare for or have resources for, but we were forced to do something about it.
Thank you. And Mr. Borowski, the Scottish Council of Jewish Communities, could you tell us about that?
It was established between the devolution referendum and devolution actually happening, because a number of us took the view that we needed to have a single one-stop shop that could engage with the new stratum of Scottish politics. Until that time, the Glasgow community, which is by far the largest community, was well structured. The Glasgow Jewish Representative Council is now more than 110 years old, and had in those days about 50 affiliated organisations involved in different aspects of communal life. But because, I was going to say the Scottish Government, but of course it wasn't, the Scottish office was based across the road from here, what actually happened was that if the Scottish office wanted to obtain a Jewish view on something, so to speak, they would tap a Jewish civil servant on the shoulder. And that, of course, is not a way of getting a representative view, even if the civil servant was in fact my wife, but that's by the by. So we decided that we really needed to set up, there was this umbrella in Glasgow, and we needed either to expand that to cover the whole country, or to have, so to speak, a super umbrella above the umbrella that also included the other communities. And it was the latter that we did, and SCOJEC, the Scottish Council of Jewish Communities, is that higher level organisation which encompasses the Glasgow community, which still has its own representative structure. Edinburgh is growing but doesn't have a representative body of its own, although that may change actually in the fairly near future. And there are, until very recently, there were synagogues in Dundee and Aberdeen. Aberdeen is still there. Dundee closed about 5 years ago, maybe slightly more, and the Tayside and Fife community, as it's now called, is actually in a cupboard in St Andrews University chaplaincy, but that's, I can explain that if you really want to know more. But then in addition to that, there's something like 20% of the people who identify as Jewish in Scotland are actually not in the cities at all. And one of the problems with the Scottish census is that we ask, the religion question in Scotland asks, pardon me, what faith or belief do you belong to? Whereas in England and Wales it asks, what are you? And therefore, if there isn't anything to belong to, people will truthfully say none of the above. And that was why we, SCOGEC, pressed for Jewish to be mentioned in the ethnicity question. And we've been proven right, because figures were published about a fortnight ago that actually said that there were 1,466 people who had not ticked the religion box, who wrote in Jewish under the ethnicity question. And it's interesting, actually, that you've got Magda and myself, because we are two of the communities that are missing from the census data. And there was research published just last week by a team based at St Andrews University that actually used the census ethnicity classification tweaked by adding the Eastern European community and the Jewish community. So a lot of the data that you're looking at actually needs to be looked at more closely, because frankly it is not granular enough to pick up actual differences between communities that are actually different from one another but are pushed into the same pigeonhole by the census.
Thank you. I'd like to talk to you now about the engagement that your groups had with the Scottish Government. We've mentioned, or Mr. Borowski's mentioned, first of all, the Ethnic Minority National Resilience Network. Mrs. Lance, I wonder whether you were involved with that.
Okay. Yeah, as part of BEMIS and the National Resilience Network that was set up, it was great because I thought that was quite a rapid response to what had happened. It was then, as a community leader and a supporter of people that I serve, I had to keep them posted on updates, what was going on. I was also the co-chair of the African Caribbean Network, and it's during the time that we also commissioned a research on COVID resistance. Of course, we know that during that time, there was a lot of uncertainty, and you have numerous calls from community members, from people who are concerned. Either it was about their children or it was about taking the vaccine. Why should they take the vaccine? And some of those questions, yes, we could answer some, but some we couldn't answer. But we were also keeping ourselves updated with information from the Scottish Government, from the NHS, and from Glasgow City Council, and just encouraging individuals where to get information, because they were getting information from social media, which was creating more panic. And we tried, as Women in Action, we also tried to create some engaging activities like home workouts, like parenting skills, because we were having issues of you're trying to work from home, then your child comes to ask for milk, or no, there's no bread, you have to stop whatever you're doing. Nobody was prepared to work from home, neither to teach their children. As I said earlier on, most parents became teachers by default because they had to figure out how to help their child, and getting frustrated also, especially if they're not skilled enough to support their children, maybe mathematics or basic English, which they themselves don't have that language. So we're having all these issues and trying to source out partners who can help. And what we could do like the home workout. It was getting them involved and their children. just inviting other experts, like for mental health, relationship, to come on our platform and speak to them, breast aware. It was just looking what is there that can help them cope with, not be more resilient with the situation at hand, because there was a lot going on. Because of confidential, sorry.
Sorry, no, I don't wish to interrupt.
Yeah, I was going to say, because
for His Lordship's benefit, could I perhaps ask who set up the Resilience Network?
that was BEMIS.
BEMIS.
I thought I said that before. I said it was a rapid response by BEMIS to have set up that network to bring all the ethnic minority communities together. And I think that was brilliant because, you know, for years we haven't really come together as a community, and then everyone's sharing the same information. You know, you kind of think, oh, I'm not alone. They are saying the same thing. They're facing the same thing. So how can we move on together as a community? So the Resilient Network, through the Resilient Network, that's how the COVID hesitancy research came about. I don't know if you need me to continue.
If I could ask you to pause there, Ms.
Okay.
Lance, for a moment. We'll come back to the hesitancy research in a little while. Mr. Borowski, prior to the setting up of the Resilience Network, was there any mechanism for BEMIS or indeed any of its representative groups to engage with the Scottish Government?
Collectively, I think probably not. I mean, some of us will have had networks of our own and so forth, and I wouldn't want to downplay that. But I think one of the points I would want to make is to draw a comparison between what the Scottish Government did for faith communities and what they didn't do for ethnic minority communities. And again, because the Jewish community sits with one leg in each of those categories, I could make that comparison. As Margaret says, I certainly want to commend BEMIS for coming up with the idea of the network and proactively taking it forward. And I in particular found that very useful because, as I said earlier when I was introducing myself, I also sat on the Police Scotland Independent Advisory Group that was looking at the COVID legislation. And it was very useful to be able to talk about the lived experience that I was hearing about at the network and feed some of that back to the IAG. But directly on the question that you asked, the Scottish Government took the initiative to bring faith communities together. I was going to say round a table, except of course it wasn't round a table, it was on a screen. But that was very useful because we shared experience, we shared advice with one another. I went round my synagogue pinning up notices that said Church of Scotland at the top because they had shared them with me. And therefore, exactly, I think as Margaret says, we knew we weren't alone. We weren't making it up. We're always being accused by people of making up absurd regulations. The fact that we were able to say, sorry, these are the rules and this is how they are being followed by faith communities in general was actually therefore in a practical way very, very helpful. But that contrasts the Scottish Government taking the initiative and setting that up. And it started out, I think, with the intent of being a channel of communication from government to the communities and thereby to their members. It then turned into, as it should have been, a two-way street because it also allowed us, when we met, to say, well, these are the pressure points, these are the issues that people are raising, these are the questions they're asking. And in fact, the value of that round table has been proven by the fact that 2 years later it still exists as a sort of general channel of communication between the Scottish Government and faith communities. Now, I contrast that with the fact that there was nothing of that kind to bring ethnic minority communities together either as a one-direction channel of communication or as a general roundtable to discuss the kinds of issues that were constantly being reported to the Minority Resilience Network. And I think it's unfortunate the Scottish Government didn't take that initiative, and I think BEMIS is very much to be commended for having filled that gap. And I hope the inquiry at some stage will actually hear from BEMIS as such, rather than from us as members.
I think there's a lot of praise for BEMIS. They did their best and under that circumstance. But at the same time, I would say BEMIS couldn't reach everybody. You know, especially, as I said, the further you are from Glasgow, Edinburgh, if you're a minority person, you don't get anything, you don't hear anything. I know about BEMIS because I've been long here. I'm even one of the founders of BEMIS, so I know about it. But many other people don't know about that. I interact with people in Fife, in Dundee, in Angus. Nobody knows about BEMIS. Not that BEMIS deliberately kept them away, but BEMIS only knew few and deal with those people, and they did their best. But then they don't have much to give people, apart from calling us for meetings and meetings and meetings, and we go there to listen. The information is just one way all the time. And with the African community, they don't differentiate, or the minority generally, they don't differentiate between information from Scotland and information from England. And so when the first information came out that ethnic minority people died a lot in COVID, everybody panicked. And that contributed to people not taking the vaccine, because it's like many of Africans and Asians, they're in healthcare system, and doctors were dying, nurses and all this. So people panic. It was later on when we were looking for Scottish information. Are these deaths in Scotland or somewhere else? Then we discovered that there are more deaths down south than up here. And then most of the information is coming from white doctors. And you can imagine that George Floyd has just been killed during COVID. Black people are already angry and say that white people want to kill them. And now you see these doctors coming telling us to go and vaccinate, go and vaccinate. Nobody wanted to do that. How are we sure they are not planning to kill us? And then with the social medias telling all kinds of theories and all these things, it made a lot of, even this morning, the taxi person that brought me to the train station told me that he didn't take the vaccine. He said, I wish I was the one coming to give this report. I would have given them an earful of what the whole thing is about. There are people who still believe that it was not real. It was something different. So for our own community, there was hesitancy, there was anger. It's like many African doctors are working with NHS, so they can't find one person that will speak to the community. You know, it's the same thing all the time. Does it mean there are no senior Africans there? There are no women, even white women coming to talk. It's always men coming to tell us what to do. So there are so many theories that make people not to take the vaccination. And as for ethnic minority, it's like we were not on the table at all. Anything that came, it was after thought. Maybe pressure from community groups saying that what about us, what about us, what about us? Because most of the community groups, they are not funded. They are just people coming together to solve little problem. But now the problem has grown out of proportion. You don't know who to contact. For me, I would say my local government tried, because we know some people, we just knock at the door. But help coming from the central government to community groups, small groups, no.
Thank you. Mrs. Czarnecka, could I bring you in here? And I'll ask you a more general question, if I may. What was your experience in terms of engagement with government?
if I can be blunt, for over a year and a half, there was no engagement with the government, with the Polish community in general, but broadly, probably speaking, with any migrant community. I would say that BEMIS was the only organization that was interested in the experiences of our communities. We had some limited capacity to engage with the resilience network, and I think in that sense, the network was incredible resource, but also support network for, as other members of the panel said already, that we were, it was the way to understand also from the political level that we were not alone in being misrepresented and, really to say, neglected by the government. So what we did as an organization, we had to obviously very quickly change our work to work online, to support our communities online. But we also quickly realized that there was no materials or engagement available in our community languages. And it was up to our staff, who at the right moment had the capacity to translate the ever-changing regulations around the social isolating. So we were we felt like we were left alone, but with full responsibility for our service users, who are very often very vulnerable. These are people who experience the same problems as the local community in terms of physical vulnerabilities, but additionally, they have problems in the language barrier. And for instance, our group, we call them active 50 plus, but actually most of the members were 70 plus. So they experienced the language barriers, digital barriers, the physical barriers, and with the lack of information from the government, they couldn't really understand what was happening and what regulations were active at the time. So we took on ourselves, and we felt really responsible for their lives at the time.
Can I ask you, Mrs. Czernicka, do you think that the Scottish Government had an understanding of your community?
Absolutely not. And I think it came out very quickly, well, not very quickly, it came out only during the first months of the vaccination rollout that that maybe there was a low vaccination, the COVID vaccination uptake. It was the first time that we heard from the government any level of interest in Polish community.
When you say a low level of uptake, do you mean within the Polish community?
Within the yes, Polish community.
And was that immediately apparent?
No, that obviously took a few months since the rollout of the vaccination. So probably a year and a half since the beginning of the pandemic.
Was there any reason why that information hadn't been apparent earlier?
It's probably the question to the government, but it's definitely something that we were asking the government through the resilience network, because we had no other channels to engage with the government. But any ethnicity data that was provided always showed that Polish and other European communities were always put into white category. So for pretty much till the first information about the vaccination hesitancy, we didn't have any information about the impact of the pandemic on the Polish community.
Just to clarify that, Ms. Czernicka, the Polish position was amalgamated with other, as you say, white European groups and therefore was lost within that data initially.
Correct. Initially, and probably still, it was interesting to learn that Public Health Scotland and also NHS collects the ethnicity information, but at some point the decision was made that when the ethnicity data was published, it didn't include or disaggregated information on ethnic minorities within white ethnic category.
You mentioned that Phoenix was approached to potentially address that issue.
Yes, it was through BEMIS and through it was a vaccination fund provided by the Scottish government to organize a campaign or to raise awareness. Probably initially the idea was coming to convince the community to take the vaccination, but at this time it was impossible to convince anybody to take the vaccination. So what we were only able to do was to promote the informed consent. Yes, I think the community was neglected for such a long time that the level of trust was breached with the government and with local authorities and regulations that at the time we are not able to do more than just provide information and to make sure that was true to the science at the time.
Could I just ask how much money did you get to support that work?
We received £1,500 to organize the whole campaign.
Thank you.
And if I can add, to compare, I think NHS or in England there was the whole PR agency employed to engage with ethnic minorities in England. So that probably also with larger funds to provide this work.
Thank you.
Can I
Mrs. Yukubu.
Yeah, in terms of information and help, whether the government communicated with us, they didn't, but we make effort to get in touch with the government. We tried to contact some of the MSPs, and in one of the meetings we had with an MSP, it was a disaster, because we were just telling her what is going on in the community, the hardship that was going on. And her first response was that, you know, you Africans, you are very corrupt. You want money. If we give you the money, you have to use it for what it's meant for, because you are very corrupt. And the people that attended this meeting, they were doctors, PhD people, community leaders. And they were just shocked. They were looking at her. And I just banged the table. I said, this is not on. We live in Scotland. No one has charged us of corruption. We are not in Africa. Whatever your experience with Africa, you shouldn't bring it here. This is something that is happening right here, right now. And after that, all of them, the leaders just lost interest in the whole thing. They didn't want to go there anymore. Most of the information that we got, fortunately, as I said, there are a lot of our people that work in NHS. And because of COVID, we now have online meetings. And so they are able to give us more information, try to help the people, encourage the community to go and vaccinate. Especially there's a GP, a Nigerian GP that go from church to church and mosque to encourage minority people. That is the only thing that we see. But to have some ministers, we wrote to them, they promised they'll get back to us. They never got back to us. So I'm sorry. My experience with them is not very positive.
Thank you, Mrs. Yukubu. Mrs. Lance, if I could bring you back in here, you mentioned vaccine hesitation as well earlier and some research that was commissioned. Could you tell us, Lordship, about that?
Right. Following the series of meetings that BEMIS was having, and I'm sure some of the Scottish Government representatives were on this board. They attended some of these meetings. Just that some of the questions that were asked, we didn't get the answers. So what happened is encouraging people to take the vaccine. It was just about giving them information so they can make informed choices. It wasn't about telling them, go and get the vaccine. And they will ask, have you taken? Yes, I have taken. Do you think I should go take? Well, you can think about it. And we brought different scenarios where, why would you trust nurses? Why would you trust healthcare providers and trust God? But you don't trust God in this vaccine. It wasn't about telling them that go and get it because, you know, nobody knew better at the time. Now, what happened with what followed the COVID hesitancy? So some took the first. Some didn't take. Some took the first, didn't take the second. Some took the second, didn't take the third. Some took the third. And all of them shared their experiences. So having a conversation with Josephine and BEMIS, we thought, right, we can't just give people vaccine without going back to them to kind of let them share their experiences. And that's how this research came about. So with Women in Action, we didn't have the money. So we told Josephine, we're going to go back to BEMIS. So we went back to BEMIS. That was under the African and Caribbean subgroup. So BEMIS got some funding through the Scottish Government, and that's how we commissioned Dr. Adekola to carry out this. At the same time, the Scottish Government was also running a research or consultation at some point. So what happened is that we then had a joint launch of that. So the report, if anyone would like to read, is on the BEMIS website. I just need to kind of rewind my brain a bit to bring out some of the things. Yeah, so that's how that research came about, and a lot was shared during that research, why people didn't want to take it, why they took the first, the second, or not take it at all, because of the uncertainty which they had before. And as you shared last time, it was like, oh, no one ever thought about us. They want to use us now like guinea pigs. And we were not the ones to tell them that, no, this is not it, but to find information that could help them make informed choices and take the vaccine. But we were not saying, go for it. But I was happy to say, I've taken it. And that was it.
Again, Ms. Lance, do you feel that the Scottish Government had an understanding of your community and how these kind of things would impact?
I don't, maybe some do, but I would generally say I don't think they do, because a common word that I've heard over the years is addressing us like a hard-to-reach community. But I keep saying repeatedly, there is no hard-to-reach community. Why? Because if you find people in the usual places, you don't see them, go to the unusual places. And that will be working with the community leaders who have already built trust with the people they serve. That is an easy gateway, and BEMIS already opened that door for them to say, okay, this is what we want to do. Can you help us bring the community leaders? Africa is a continent with 54 countries, and all of these countries are as diverse as the continent itself. So getting to...
Sorry, Ms Lance, could I just stop you there? I'm being informed that we have a potential breach, my lord. My lord.
Mr Turner, all sorted?
All is fine, my lord. I understand our abundance of caution is unnecessary.
Better safe than sorry.
Okay.
Mrs Lance, if I could ask you, you were telling us about your research and...
Yeah. Sorry about the hiccup. Yeah, so this research was commissioned just to go back to individuals and find out how they felt, what made them to not to take one and not the other, just general experience and the discussion. But you also asked if the Scottish government kind of did engage or is engaging with the community. And I was saying that not as much as they could have done. They could do better if they go through BEMIS or other organizations that are serving these communities. And I said the common phrase that I hear is that the hard-to-reach communities. They're not a hard-to-reach communities because I said if you can't find people in usual places, you can always get them through the unusual places, which will be through the community leaders that have their own communities, through the faith communities where they've already established. And saying that Africa, with 54 countries, these countries are as diverse as the individuals living in it. So you can't take somebody from west of Africa to feel that, oh, they are the same with somebody from the southern part or Horn of Africa. You may not know, but it's not something I can elaborate more, but just looking at the map and seeing the divisions. Some people don't speak English. Some people speak English, but they're not literate in the language. Even to say that, oh, we've provided resources in various languages. People are not certainly literate in certain languages, even though they speak these languages. So how would we know? We can only know if we engage with the communities. To support a community, you have to engage with them. If you don't have ways, get through those who already have the platform that you can engage with them. Personally, I had lots of issues reaching out to those communities myself. Even though I am from Africa, I'm still learning. For over 20 years, I'm still learning, and COVID and the lockdown, the COVID pandemic and the lockdown really made me to see things that I wouldn't have seen, and that stretched me out to seek ways of supporting the communities. We want to say a big thank you again to BEMIS, because having no resources, they were able to send us to identify individuals within the community that may need support, who were digitally disconnected, which was a major issue. How do you even call your GP? How do you even call someone to say, I don't have food? What am I entitled to? Can I even take this food? Shall I even take this device? I have no recourse to public funds. What are they going to ask for my details? I'm not going to take that if they're going to request my details, because this could expose me. But because they know us, our phones keep, ringing or messages coming. Can you support this person? I would also call. Do you know anyone in Aberdeen? This person, Bertha, can you support so-so in Aberdeen? And most of these organizations that we were contacting had just volunteers. So the volunteers had to go out at that time. That is how we supported each other with the little funding support that was coming from BEMIS as well. So for me in particular, I don't have funding. My previous organization was also supporting our service users, not the general public. So if you were not a service user of that particular organization, you wouldn't go there. And then those also living with the condition didn't also want to be signposted because they didn't want to be disclosed. If I go there, they're gonna know that I'm living with a condition and I don't want to go. Could you go get it for me? Some of the things, some of the requests were kind of overwhelming sometimes for us, because we didn't know exactly what to do or how to respond to certain situations where you see a single mom with children don't have food. So, yeah, it was tough.
For me, one of the reasons, or some of the reasons why people were hesitant in taking the vaccine, as I've said, there was already suspicion about Africans being used for drug experiments, even in Africa. You know, there are instances where companies have gone to test their drugs. So there are people that are already suspicious that this new vaccine, they have not tested it, they will use us as a guinea pig to do it, they won't do it. Another reason is like, there are people that have no recourse to the public. So they have no food to eat. They can't pay their rent. And now the government says, go and vaccinate. I have to leave before I vaccinate. Right now, you are more interested for me to go and vaccinate, but you don't know whether I eat or I don't eat. So why should I go and vaccinate? So there are many reasons. And then the third reason is just that a lot of people were just afraid. They don't know the outcome, how it will affect them. And then there's the faith. Every research with ethnic, especially with Africans, they always go to health system at a later time because they believe in divine intervention. They will pray to God first. They would say, oh, God forbid, I won't get COVID. So there's this cultural thing that we have to go through. So, and that is why I was critical of the government not bringing ethnic minority in terms of giving information, because they would have reassured their people that it is safe, it is okay, because they come from the same area. You can't just kill your own people. But when somebody else is telling you, and you have history of the same people trying this thing in Africa with children, with women, with everything. In America, the Tuskegee experiment. So many people were just skeptic about the vaccination, and they wouldn't take it. And during the discussion, because after the post-research, they have to discuss the outcome of the research with community group. And that was what was coming out of the discussion. The reason why people weren't going to vaccinate, because some were afraid, some don't believe, some think the government doesn't care about them. Why would they care about vaccination? It's only that they want to experiment with us.
Thank you. Mr. Borowski, can I ask you, were there any particular impacts on your community that you wish to highlight?
Could I just make a general observation first that relates to what I think all of us have said? Last time I spoke, I drew attention to the fact that you've got representatives of two communities that generally get left out of the standard ethnicity categorization. The points that you've just been hearing is, to put it crudely, Africa's quite a big place. But as far as the census is concerned, it's all in the same box. So that's kind of mirror image of exactly the same issue. There's another aspect of diversity which gets ignored very often, which has been touched on by a couple of us already, which is, for want of a better expression, geographical diversity. Now, it makes perfectly good sense if you're doling out resources to dole them out to where the largest number of people are. But the greatest need actually might be where the smallest number of people are, who fall between the cracks because they are, to all intents and purposes, invisible. There was one point, for example, when one of our local authorities, maybe I shouldn't say which, referred to, would respond to questions in this area by saying, oh, it's okay, it provided resources for its ethnic minority community. Notice the singular. And that just shows the mindset, not ethnic minority communities, which are as diverse, as different from one another as society at large. Your specific question about the Jewish community, we were, I think, differentially affected because of the timing, not of the pandemic, but of the lockdown. which came 2 weeks before Passover. Now that meant that, I suppose it's partly to do with the age profile of the community, whatever. The vast majority of people go away. They join their families who are not in Scotland. They're in London or the States or Israel. It's a family time, and people were planning to go away and therefore had made no provision to stay here at a time when there are specific dietary restrictions. So we were in a position where people were completely wrong-footed. Their travel plans were now all cancelled. They're stuck at home, and they've got nothing to eat for the next fortnight. So that was something that had to be addressed. The Scottish Government set up emergency funding, not just for us, but there was a fund that they made available to minorities, and we, SCOGEC, arranged with the various welfare organisations to make that available for people who might otherwise have been left completely high and dry during the week-long festival. So that was a very specific effect on the Jewish community. Pardon me. In addition to that, the Institute for Jewish Policy Research, based in London, was tracking COVID-related deaths, not just in the UK, but comparing them with Europe, and they've done some very deep and very detailed studies of those. Refreshing my memory about that last night, they came to the conclusion that the most reliable statistic was actually excess deaths, because you can't rely on death certificates, which are to some extent subjective. They're not being completed by pathologists. They're completed by the last medical professional to have anything to do with this particular deceased patient. And also there was, I mean, everybody was always making the distinction between dying of COVID and dying with COVID. So all of that is in the mix. So they decided that the only thing they could actually look at was gross numbers. And what they spotted was that the excess deaths in Scotland were significantly higher than the excess deaths in England. I don't know if they've ever come up with an explanation for that. I was looking at that again last night, and in fact, the vast majority of the excess deaths in the Jewish community in Scotland were in Glasgow. There were very few in Edinburgh. I think in Edinburgh they had 4 rather than an expected 3, so that's going to be within the margin of error no matter what statistical tests you apply. And in the other communities it was a uniform 0 because they're very small. But in Glasgow, people were definitely concerned by the numbers of funerals that they were hearing about. What I think was the case, and this may not be 100% accurate, but when I tried to dig a little deeper, it turned out that the vast majority of the deaths that people were concerned about were of people in their 90s, with one exception, who was in her late 80s. So these may have been excess deaths. They may not have taken place exactly when they did, but they weren't, shall we say, entirely unexpected. So you have to factor all that in. There are lots of variables when you're looking at these statistics, but those, I think, were the two things that had an impact directly on the community. The vast majority of the Jewish community in Scotland are, at the very least, 3rd generation, so we don't have some of the problems that my colleagues have been talking about with language or whatever it might be. From that perspective, they are more part of the majority. I'm not aware of any vaccine resistance out of the ordinary. There may be concern about some of the restrictions on social gathering and travel and that kind of thing. But I think one of the things that I picked up very much from the Resilience Network and passed on to the police and, for that matter, the politicians, was that those restrictions were always going to have a differential impact in terms of social deprivation, for example. If you have a car in a big back garden, you're far less likely to be in breach of COVID regulations than if you're on the 17th floor of a high-rise. So these kinds of things have an impact, and there's actually an ethnic dimension to those statistics as well, because there's a correlation between economic activity, how long people have been in this country, etc., etc. So it's always going to be extremely difficult to unpick that.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Could I perhaps move on slightly? We've spoken about communications with the Scottish Government. I'd now like to just ask Mrs. Czarnecka, could I ask about how you were helping your community in terms of information or other support at the time?
In terms of information sharing, we were translating the information. Actually, the first stage was analyzing and understanding what the new regulations were, so we were able to kind of dissect them into small chunks of understandable information and then translate them to Polish. We were often finding ourselves reading 4 or 3 different documents to understand whether now you can meet your friends or you not meet your friends, what's the number of people you can meet. At the time, the information wasn't clear. So with the little resource, first of all, we had no support from the Scottish Government to do that. So we were using whatever the capacity of staff we had at the time, and volunteers as well. And then we were sharing this information on through the social media, because we still think our community is the most it's the most active on certain groups on social media platforms. But in terms of direct support, as a mental health organization, we were increasing our capacity to provide mental health support, but also information sharing, and also helping directly, especially our mostly vulnerable and older service users. We were supporting them in accessing healthcare, because what happened was that every GP practice introduced the answering machine that were extremely difficult to go through if you didn't know the language. There was no language support from any other on this very basic level of accessing healthcare. There were already barriers that were absolutely impossible to go through by our service users. So our community development worker at the time took on the role of pretty much advocacy or care worker to access health, request prescriptions, talk to the pharmacy. So we took on the role of supporting the community where we were not exactly set up to do that. We also saw an increase, obviously, in social isolation and also in mental health problems, also domestic abuse. All our waiting lists for mental health support have increased pretty much by 100%. The amount of domestic abuse as well increased by 60% in terms of how many women we supported at the time, and referred to for support from other organizations. So yeah, we had a very dire picture of the community at the time, and we think we did everything we could, actually, with the little resource that we received.
Thank you. And just to be clear, did you receive any additional resource to assist with your work?
Yes, we applied for the resilience. There were a few emergency funds, also from the Scottish Government, but also other funders that we had a relationship with. So they funded our mental health support mostly. But yes, we had no kind of like for information sharing. That was there was nothing at the time. We worked through actually the Resilience Network. We worked with partners from other cities, like PCAFs, for instance, that at the time also had very active minority ethnic center. So we were using the kind of partnerships that were shaped during the at the network to address the needs, at least information sharing within the communities.
Can I just, excuse me, before I move on, Mrs. Janecka, could I ask you, you mentioned there mental health, which is obviously one of the issues that your organisation deals with prominently. We know from Mrs. Yakubu in other communities that members of the community can be disparate, and that can have an impact in terms of their ability to see each other and to be around each other. Does that apply to your community at all?
Absolutely. So I think what the general messaging at the time within in the media was that the neighborhoods worked really well for the neighborhood support was really working really well for the communities, but it turned out it wasn't working for the Polish community, for instance, because it seems like our members live in quite often in precarious conditions, but also in the areas of the cheaper housing. So quite frequently multiple deprivation areas as well, but it seems like they build connections and support through the network. The networks, let's say, they are reaching a lot further than the whatever it is 20 minutes neighborhood. So many of them were left isolated and with no capacity to connect with friends. We also saw a huge impact on single parents who are often the ones we support are often survivors of domestic abuse, and then they were basically trapped at home. Also due the school regulations, so that the schools were closed and they were not able to organize a childcare for themselves, for the children. So they had to resign from work in order to support the children, and that led them to destitution. We were, I don't have the number at the top of my head, but we were supporting a number of women to accessing food and accessing food banks, and also other financial support if possible, because yeah, women who are often in between making decisions, either looking after the children or going to work and having food at the table. And that was, yes, that was really distressing for also for the staff to making sure to provide for those people.
Thank you. Mrs. Lance, could I ask you a similar question? Were there any particular reasons why people in your community needed support, and what support was available for them?
The answer is yes, they needed support. Most of them, as I discussed earlier on, have got no recourse to public funds, single parents, between 1 and 4 or 5 children, young children. Some were trapped, I agree with what my colleague just said there, trapped in abusive relationship. I got lots of calls and shared parenting. If the mother is living with the child and you get the child say, I want to see my dad, I want to see my dad. There was this to and fro. And some would leave the relationship and then instantly they want to go back because I can't cope with going to see my dad or not going to see my dad. So they were trapped in that relationship because of the situation that they found themselves in. Others were trapped in abusive relationships because of their immigration status. They didn't know what was going to happen to them. In terms of picking up medications, some couldn't, so we facilitated arranging to get their medication either delivered to them or we would pick them up. It was quite tough, and to encourage people to take their medication with uncertainty. Oh, I better just die. Maybe it's a time for me to die now. Let me just die. But sometimes you have to school yourself to be strong enough when you are asking somebody to be resilient. You have to school yourself to be strong enough to provide the support that that person needed. And sometimes we don't have all the answers to the questions that they would ask. And in terms of picking up food, yes, I already said, some I've got no recourse to public funds. Most of those who worked in the hospitality, can't even pronounce, in the hospitality industry, they lost their jobs. Some, those who were in care home or working on 0-hour contracts, they lost their jobs, which means that they couldn't afford basic needs for themselves and their children. That's where coordinating and working with other organizations was really important. Rewinding, I'm just trying to think of a situation that came across, and was a young lady, single parent, with a young baby who passed away during the pandemic because she couldn't get the support that she needed. I think she gave up on herself with her baby dying. I mean, she died 3 days, the baby was by her side. The housing didn't know. It's a partner that finally came because calling, she wasn't picking. He decided to come closer. The door was locked. Informed the neighbors, informed the police. They broke through the door and found out that she was already dead. I wouldn't reveal the post-mortem about it, but it's something that could have been prevented. Fortunately, the baby was alive and is still alive. And you look at us like, community leaders or workers during that time, and all the information that you absorb or something that you come across, you also need to look after your own health and well-being to be able to support somebody. Some of us had to seek counseling as well because it was very tough to to be supporting somebody and tomorrow the person is no longer there or just see photos. So there was a lot that people needed. Those who couldn't speak a language, lots of deaths were about. The next day you just hear, oh, you know, this person has passed away. And you kind of think, oh, I wish I could do more. Sometimes you think you can do more. And COVID has taught me, and I'm sure all of us, the power of communities coming together and showing love and kindness to everyone, because everyone stepped up. There was no single referral that I made and they said no. Somebody would go out there to support. I personally didn't have funding, but I was just there to share knowledge and make sure that the women that I serve had a platform where they see themselves as family. Another thing with this community is that the only time that they can actually get together is over the weekend or late in the evening. And that's why I created that platform, so I could bring them up. At that time, most offices are closed. 5 o'clock, everyone is gone. You can't get anybody, but they need to speak to somebody. And that's why we would work evenings, Saturdays, and Sundays, because that's the only time we reach these communities. And if I'm not saying that everyone should do it, but that's a better way to do it, or get in touch with somebody to facilitate that. It makes it easier for us to reduce some of the issues and challenges. Yes, the African community, we had lots of issues to deal with, and we could only do that with what we had at the time. Thank you.
Thank you. We have just a few minutes left. What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask each in turn if there's anything that you would particularly like to highlight, either something we've touched on before or something else that you would like to highlight. One of the things His Lordship will be doing in the inquiry is identifying and learning lessons. If there is any particular lessons that you think His Lordship should consider, I'd be particularly interested to hear that. Mr. Borowski, could I perhaps give you the floor first, if there is anything that you would like to raise with His Lordship?
No, I was afraid of that. I think, first of all, just an observation on what Margaret's been saying. Obviously, my focus from things I've been saying earlier has been largely on the small p political aspects of the pandemic and its effects on the community. But as far as the welfare organisations within the Jewish community are concerned, there's often a false perception that we're by and large a middle class and fairly wealthy community and so forth, and therefore the kinds of issues that the others have been talking about don't apply. That is untrue. And in fact, I referred earlier to the timing of the first lockdown. The result of that was that we had to put in place, and as I said, we did have some emergency funding from the Scottish Government. We had to put in place mechanisms to give people food parcels, not just because of the practicalities of getting the special Passover food, but because of the cost and because people had to be, in effect, provided with the same kind of resources that other minority communities find. There's also groups of more recent refugees and so forth who are loosely affiliated to the community. And when there are pressures on them, of course, we'll hear about them more than we would, as it were, in normal day-to-day activity. So many of these issues applied to us as well. I think the most general point I would make in terms of lessons to learn is the contrast that I made earlier between how the Scottish Government engaged with faith communities and how it failed to engage with ethnic minority communities, quite aside from the paucity of proper ethnicity data, because what data are collected or not collected in a way that actually reflects people's self-identification with communities. So lesson learned number one for me would be, and this applies to everything and not just to pandemics, is that the issue about census data needs to be resolved across the entire piece. We need to have proper data, proper disaggregated data. It is simply not the case that there are 14 ethnic groups in Scotland, full stop. That's simply not true, and you've heard examples facing in both directions. So there's lesson number one. Lesson number two is that if there is ever an emergency of this kind, or indeed of any other kind as in the future, the Scottish Government needs to think about how it communicates with communities. Now, that will include issues about translation of the kind that we've heard from Magda. It'll include issues about geography and the very thin spread of minorities in the north and the south that I referred to earlier. Naturally, most of us have a focus on the M8 and indeed the two ends of the M8. It's natural, but we have to overcome it if we're actually going to support people in Scotland. So that's a second point, and related to that is finding the right kind of network, as they did, and I'm commending them for this, as they did with faith communities, so that they've got a channel from government to representatives of faith communities, and through representatives of faith communities to their local branches, for want of a better word, and through them to the members of the community who are in fact people in Scotland. So it may be a 3 or 4 step process, but it's extremely valuable for getting those messages out there. And the other is to pay a lot of attention to the social deprivation. Magda mentioned that as well, that not everybody is challenged in the same way. And if you're going to help people in Scotland, hyphenated again, to overcome the challenges that are unasked for, then you have to do it where they are, and that means being able to identify where they are, not just physically, but psychologically as well.
Thank you. Mrs. Yakubu, could I come to you next? And I'm conscious we are short of time, so if you could try to be as brief as possible, I'd be grateful.
I think COVID has just shown us that not everybody has the resilience to withstand such a thing. So especially the minority groups. So we hope that the government look at this, that not all community can withstand some of the pressures that they have. In terms of mental health, I think one of the groups that is forgotten in this conversation is students. Students went through hell because many of them do work to pay their school fees or pay their rent, and during that time there was no work, so they have nothing. And we have 2 instances where students have phoned us thinking of ending it all until we say, okay, we give you the vouchers for food or pay the rent for some months and all this. So, and then some of them, the university, because they couldn't pay fees, they couldn't even use the facilities in the school because they were locked out of the portals. They couldn't see their supervisors. So there was a lot of stress in that area of students. So we have to remember that if we allow students to come here and something like this happen, the government have to think of the people that live here. You know, they couldn't travel back home because nobody is allowed to travel, and yet they are stuck. And some landlord chased them out of their house. So students must be factored into this the equation. And as I said, community groups think they have resilience, but COVID show us that we don't have resilience. And we also don't have a voice. We also don't have a face. So the government should think of all these things, that this is a multicultural society. If you want to reach everybody, representation matters.
Thank you. Mrs. Czarnecka, could I come to you next? And again, if I could ask you, please, if possible, to be brief.
Sure. If there is one lesson learned for sure was that I think public sector equality duties were sort of forgotten at the time where the response to the pandemic was rolled out, and it included the rollout of the vaccination campaign. What I would also say, it seemed that there was some sort of selective approach to the minorities, and pretty much the migrant groups were completely forgotten in the whole process, even though it's proven that many worked and essential workers providing and producing food for the whole Scotland, and even though they haven't had enough recognition for their work, but also recognition for the conditions, the work they provide, they worked, but also they lived. So it's the access to and multiplied by and exacerbated by the issues they already experienced, the language barrier, the cultural barriers in accessing any sort of support before the pandemic and during the pandemic. And I think another lesson to be learned is by public health to engage with the communities ahead and maintain the relationships with the community ahead of events like pandemic, which we are apparently expecting another one at some point in our lifetime. So this engagement should exist even ahead of before events like this. And what I would like to say as well, that this engagement needs to be meaningful, and also the community leaders need to be supported in it, like through funding or in other through information, because otherwise it looks like a tick boxing exercise that for some people, they think they do their job by sending information to us, but it's not really. Still, we don't have resources to further engage with communities on very specific topics that they might be promoting.
Thank you. Mrs. Lance, I said I would give you a brief opportunity, if you could be very, very brief, if you have anything else you would like to mention.
Thank you very much. I suppose I'll just kind of reiterate the issue of representation. We know that the Scottish Government can do better. They're doing a fantastic job, but they can get better if they communicate well with the communities. If there is representations, I am aware of certain committees that are representing the ethnic minority community, but none of the ethnic minority members are there. And it's unfair to represent me when you haven't approached me to know what are the issues going on in my life, how can I help? So I think they can do better if they do that. And also, everyone's spoken about engagement. I believe that engagement and communications, these are the keys to reach out to people. If we don't engage with people, how can you support them? There are means to do that if they wish to, because the platforms are already out there. And not to lump people together, because when you lump people together, it's very difficult. I know that each and everyone is playing their part, but how can we delegate or just say, you do this, you do that? Research is good, academias are good, but we cannot rely on one part of information to represent people. And the last thing I'm going to say is, with regards to consultations and surveys, the government needs to give the people the time, because if you give 2 weeks, 2 months, 1 month, it's never been 2 months, it's difficult to reach the people that need that information or that need to give you the information that is required. So, yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. My Lord, that draws this panel to a close, unless your Lordship has anything you wish to ask directly.
No, thank you very much, Mr. Turner, and thank the panel members for their participation and attendance here this morning. And that's all. We'll come back after lunch at 1:45.